Hey guys, in this video, going to be recapping the predictions that I made for the Iowa caucus, and I'm going to continue to do this throughout the entire primary season with every single state making my prediction on who I think is going to come in first, second, and third place respectively in the vote in each state, and seeing where I went right, where I went wrong, and keeping a cumulative percentage on how many that I end up getting correct. Now, it seems inconceivable, but we're still at a point where we do not have 100% of the precincts reporting in Iowa going on into the late evening of Wednesday, but we are to a point now with 92% of the precincts where I feel pretty confident that we know who's going to get first, second, and third place respectively in the vote numbers. So as a result, I feel like it's pretty reasonable that I can go through and see where I went right and wrong with these predictions. Now, beyond this, I'm also going to be keeping track of the pledged delegates that each candidate ends up receiving from each state. I'm going to be updating that in my pledged delegate tracker. Once the candidate is able to reach 1,990 pledged delegates, that would get them to a point where they would win the nomination on the first ballot at the Democratic convention. But still, with not 100% of the results in, we don't know yet how many pledged delegates each candidate are going to officially be getting in the Iowa caucuses. So as soon as that happens, I'll be making another video updating the pledged delegate tracker with those final results. Now, this past week with the Iowa caucus, it's really shaken my faith in our democratic system. I hope it's just simply human error and incompetence and not malice, but a lot of individuals have been combing through the results and have found a lot of discrepancies with things that haven't been reported correctly, or these delegates not being divvied up in the proper manner. So that's something that is a concern. I hope it's not a widespread thing that's happening, and hopefully it's just more of a minimal case-by-case scenario, but hopefully at the end of the day they end up getting all of the right numbers. So the numbers that you're seeing right now on the screen are the individuals who showed up to the caucus, and their first choice, they said, I want to vote for this candidate. Those are the numbers that were here on the first initial result, where you had Bernie Sanders, and again, this is 92% of the results at this point, but Sanders was a little over 40,000 votes, Buttigieg about 5,000 back of that, Warren about 5,000 back of that, and then again, Joe Biden about 5,000 back, and then Amy Klobuchar, interestingly enough, about 5,000 back of that. So actually kind of an interesting stepping stone from each candidate, where you gain about 4,000 or 5,000 votes in each instance, and then there was a little bit more of a gap before you got to Andrew Yang, who brought in a little over 8,000, and Tom Steyer around 3,000. But since these candidates here that were beyond the top three in a number of instances didn't reach viability, so then they had the option that if they wanted to, they could support another candidate. So then when we go to the final alignment, we can see that things tightened up a bit there at the top, where right now Sanders has about a 1,200 or so vote lead over Pete Buttigieg, and then there's around a 7,000 to 8,000 vote gap, actually closer to around 8,000 votes there between Pete Buttigieg and Elizabeth Warren, and then a 10,000 vote gap between Warren and Joe Biden. And Biden was relatively competitive with Klobuchar, who was around 19,000, but Andrew Yang probably getting screwed more than anyone else in terms of able to get a decent amount of votes, but not viable in a lot of areas, where he ended up only getting 1,700 in that second alignment, and then uncommitted brings in around 1,400. Tom Steyer also going down quite a bit in that final alignment there at 371. But this is the final alignment, and this is what I'm going to be using for who ended up winning the Iowa caucus with that popular vote in the final alignment. Also, just one more piece of data here, obviously, is the number of delegates that each of these candidates are getting across the state. Now, these are in some relation, obviously, to how many votes that you end up getting, but it's not perfect. You can actually be behind in the popular vote, but be ahead in the number of delegates that you've been able to pick up across the state. And right now, it's extremely competitive at the top between Buttigieg and Sanders. With this particular metric, they're within about 1 percentage point of each other. And then Elizabeth Warren is there at about 366 of these delegates, whereas Buttigieg and Sanders each have over 500. And then Biden has a little over 300, Amy Klobuchar at 243 in that instance. And then this is what will be used to decide how many of the pledged delegates these candidates end up receiving from Iowa. And it seems like Pete Buttigieg and Bernie Sanders are both going to be at the top and both probably get the same amount of pledged delegates from Iowa, or within about one or two of each other one way or the other, but likely to be extremely competitive there at the top. But again, to go back to the popular vote in that final alignment, which is what I'm going to be using here for my predictions, and of course throughout all of caucus and primary season, I'm going to be basing what I got right and wrong on the popular vote and how many people actually ended up putting their support behind these particular candidates. So in this instance, I was able to get my first choice right here. Coming in first place with that vote number, you have Bernie Sanders. And Bernie Sanders was starting to do really well in a lot of the Iowa polls in the run-up to the Iowa caucus compared to what we had seen from him months prior. Pete Buttigieg, he actually was very high in many of the Iowa polls, particularly when he was seeing his surge through the month of November, but then he had kind of fallen back a bit, and I felt like this was a situation where that might be enough for him to kind of fall out of that top upper tier, and that's why in this instance I'd put him in third place, but to put a nice green correct shade there behind Bernie Sanders. The biggest error that I had made was putting Joe Biden in second place. This is an error that I should have seen coming beforehand, because in a caucus, you have to have really committed supporters because it takes a lot longer. It's much more complicated, time-consuming, so that ends up helping the individuals, again, that are very passionate supporters, which Joe Biden lacks. And then also it's just really important to have a very strong ground game to get that vote out. And Biden had a very weak ground game in Iowa in comparison to Bernie Sanders, Pete Buttigieg, and Elizabeth Warren. And as a result, that's pretty much how things ended up playing out, with the individuals that put a lot more effort into having success in Iowa were able to do so. So a big fat red result there for the Joe Biden prediction. That was the biggest mistake here. Actually, beforehand, I had predicted who I thought was going to get the top 5, but I'm only officially doing the top 3 for the instances of how many that I end up getting correct. But I got Klobuchar right at 5th. I had Warren in 4th, Buttigieg in 3rd, Biden in 2nd, and Sanders in 1st. So essentially, the biggest mistake there was Biden. If I would have taken him out of 2nd place and placed him in 4th, then the rest of the order behind that, with Buttigieg followed by Warren, followed by Klobuchar, ended up being a bit more accurate. But these caucuses are a concern for Joe Biden, but fortunately for him, there aren't as many caucuses in 2020 in comparison to what we had in 2016. It was an initiative and a recommendation that the Democratic Party gave to the states, where they recommended going to primaries as opposed to doing caucuses. So perhaps not quite as big of a concern for Joe Biden over the course of the entire primary season, but we do have another caucus coming up in Nevada, which could be a concern for him. Now, it is a closed caucus in Nevada, but you can actually end up registering to the Democratic Party even all the way up to and on the day of the caucus, so not much of a barrier of entrance for that one, as opposed to a lot of these other states that have closed caucuses or primaries where you have to register with the party a number of weeks or months in advance. That's not going to be the case for Nevada. So it's going to be really interesting to see how that one plays out. But with the very poor performance from Joe Biden in Iowa, the statistical models and the betting public have severely gone away from Biden. His numbers have taken a huge hit in that instance. The weakness that Joe Biden here had in Iowa, it's a concern certainly for his chances to go on and win the nomination, because when you're an individual that's out there with your number one thing being, I can beat Donald Trump, I'm the most electable, and then you go into the first result and you get a pretty distant 4th place, not a good look for Biden. We'll see what happens. He's probably not going to have a ton of success in New Hampshire. Maybe he's able to eke out a 2nd place, but with this poor result in Iowa, probably takes a step back potentially in what he's going to get in New Hampshire, and then the dominoes could fall from there, potentially maybe even then underperforming in another caucus out there in Nevada. South Carolina seems like a firewall for him, where he's probably going to go on and win that one, even if he is not having success through the first 3 states. But again, we're going to have to see how all of that ends up playing out. So then in 3rd place, I had put Pete Buttigieg, and even though Pete had been doing really well in Iowa through November and December in a lot of the polls, he had taken a step back in the polls leading up to Iowa. And it wasn't just in that instance, it was also his national numbers where he had taken a step back. So I thought the momentum had kind of faded there for Pete. And I really underestimated the effort and ground game that he had set up in the state of Iowa. He's kind of all in these first 2 states to kind of fake it till you make it, that kind of situation where he's not polling very well nationally, but if you can surprise a lot of people in the first 2 results, then that can boost up your numbers nationally and make you more relevant on the national stage. So a smart strategy, certainly from the South Bend mayor. And he's putting himself into his best position that he can in terms of being very competitive there at the top along with Bernie Sanders. But that prediction also ended up being incorrect, so also going to fill that one in red. So then that means I ended up getting 1 out of 3. Not what I was hoping for here in the first state, but nonetheless, 33.33% correct in that first result. That also ends up being the total cumulative percentage correct with only one result on the board. So what happened here in Iowa actually is good news clearly for Pete Buttigieg, but it's also actually extremely positive news for Bernie Sanders. And him and his campaign have to be feeling great about the luck that they're in with the centrist and establishment now in a position to siphon off even more vote from what had been the frontrunner in Joe Biden. Essentially, over this entire past year, Joe Biden has been the clear frontrunner. Quite a gap between him and the rest of the field in the average of the national polls. Also, he's been the odds-on favorite in the betting markets for the better part of this past year. But then you get a late entrant from Michael Bloomberg flooding the airwaves with his ad campaign. And of course, he's going into that centrist establishment type lane. So that's likely siphoning off some of that Joe Biden support. And then you have somebody like Pete Buttigieg who surprises out of the gate in Iowa, has a bit more success than maybe what many were expecting him, and he's also occupying that centrist lane, and he's likely to also be starting to siphon off a bit more of that Joe Biden vote. And now we're all of a sudden to a point where Joe Biden is no longer the front runner and the clear favorite to go on and win this thing, and it's all thanks to other establishment centrist type candidates who have been siphoning off that support. So it kind of opens up a clear lane and a pathway for Bernie Sanders to possibly go on and win the nomination. We'll see how long all of these candidates end up staying in the race, but this is just the first result, and it seems like a number of them are going to be committed to staying in this race for quite a bit of time. Now, for instance, in this particular Iowa result, the fact that Elizabeth Warren did quite well ended up hurting Bernie Sanders in the sense that there was 3 centrist candidates, and with Joe Biden and Amy Klobuchar in a number of these caucus sites not able to reach the viability of 15%, that ended up boosting Pete Buttigieg quite a bit in terms of the final round of votes, with Klobuchar and Biden supporters in a lot of instances going over and putting their support behind Pete. But with Elizabeth Warren consistently performing above the 15 percentage point threshold in many of these caucuses means that the progressive vote wasn't able to go over to what had been the top option of the progressives of Bernie Sanders. So that's also kind of an interesting dynamic that was at play here in Iowa, but won't be at play in a lot of other states. Of course, going into primaries, for instance, it would be like these results that we had on the first round where the individuals showed up and they put their first support behind individuals, and that was a case where you actually had Bernie Sanders doing a bit better and a bit more of a gap between him and Pete Buttigieg than after the fact with the realignment based on the oddities of these caucuses and being viable or not, and then being able to support a second choice or not in that instance. So to wrap this one up, this was the first state recapping my prediction. I was able to get perhaps the most important prediction right, which is first place, but it was really tricky in Iowa. A difficult one to predict accurately, just given how close and competitive the top 4 to 5 options had been in many of the polls leading up to Iowa. Joe Biden, that prediction ended up biting me. It was very off. I should have done a better job of seeing that one coming, just given the fact that somebody like a Joe Biden, not a big surprise to see them not able to overly succeed in a caucus, given that he doesn't have that super enthusiastic type of support that is very beneficial to having success in a caucus. I appreciate you guys stopping by. Consider subscribing to the YouTube channel, and of course, I hope to see you back here for my next video.